gladiators are synonymous with Rome. They're the star of movies, video games, and countless books. We associate them with violence, bloodshed, and the brutality of the ancient world. But there is much more to the story, because the Romans didn't see gladiators as we do today. To them, it wasn't just about the blood sport. It was also about politics, religion, and identity. In fact, while scholars used to think that gladiators were condemned criminals, sentenced to die in the arena, we now know that only 1 out of 5 were condemned. And most of those actually died outside the arena due to accidents or disease. So how did the other 4 fight and then go home afterwards? Well, that's what we'll find out today as we uncover the surprising origin story of the gladiator. Emperor Commodus made gladiators cool again in the movie Gladiator, which is ironic considering he's also responsible for their downfall. You see, during his 18-year reign, Rome became obsessed with gladiatorial combat. He built new amphitheaters across the city and organized tournaments lasting several days with thousands of combatants. In fact, some historians estimate that 100,000 men fought under Commodus, dying one by one, until the emperor himself was killed. But this interest in gladiators didn't come out of nowhere. It had deep roots going back centuries before. In fact, many believe they can be traced all the way back to an ancient tribe called the Etruscans. You see, around 800 BCE, the Etruscans settled in what's now central Italy. They worshipped a number of gods, but none more important than the one they called the Lord of the Dead. That's because he ruled the underworld, granting or withholding rewards based on how well he was treated. And boy, did they treat him well. In fact, the Etruscans held festivals in his honor where they unleashed wild animals into the streets, forcing citizens to fight for their lives. And if they survived, they were rewarded with gold. Over time, these events grew into massive competitions with teams from across the region coming together to appease the Lord of the Dead. They sacrificed boars, bulls, and even elephants, staging hunts that took place inside circular enclosures. This tradition continued on and off for over 5 centuries until the Romans showed up. The Etruscans had been conquered by Rome in 264 BCE, but instead of destroying their culture, the Romans admired it, adopting many of their customs as their own. For example, the hunt was now called the Ludi Romani, or Roman Games, and instead of appeasing the Lord of the Dead, it would celebrate the goddess of the hunt. They kept the circular enclosure as well, calling it the circus. It was located near the Roman Forum and hosted events like chariot races, reenactments of famous battles, and theatrical performances. But none were more popular than the gladiatorial combats. The Romans loved watching people fight, cheer. So when 2 soldiers named Gaius and Titus Carbo decided to settle a disagreement in the middle of the circus, everyone was thrilled. People placed bets on who would win. Merchants sold food and drinks, and spectators packed the stands. By the end, both men were dead, which was seen as a victory for the Roman people. This happened sometime between 105 and 91 BCE, and according to legend, it was the catalyst for gladiatorial combat becoming part of Roman culture. The fights began as a sideshow at horse races and religious festivals, but soon enough, they were their own event. Fights were organized between 2 groups of condemned criminals, each backed by a wealthy Roman. They provided weapons, armor, and training. And whoever walked away alive got their freedom and their fortune. At first, these fights were private affairs, only attended by the elite. But as they grew in popularity, everyone wanted in on the action. Soon enough, the gladiator matches were being sponsored by emperors, generals, and even the Senate itself. They constructed amphitheaters across the empire, the biggest of which was the Colosseum. Completed in 80 AD, it could hold up to 80,000 spectators. It hosted animal hunts, executions, reenactments, and especially gladiatorial combat. You might think this was the golden age of the gladiator, but you'd be wrong. See, while gladiators were revered by the masses, the elite saw them as barbaric. Cicero openly criticized their treatment and even wrote a letter begging his friend not to sponsor a deadly match. And while the Colosseum had room for 80,000 people, most shows only drew in 10 to 50,000 spectators. So while Rome loved gladiators, they didn't love the fights themselves. The real fans lived in the provinces. In fact, the Romans mostly associated gladiators with sacrifice.
Sure.
They enjoyed watching them battle, but to them, it was still a form of entertainment rooted in religion. And the best example of this is the Festa Ludi Romani, or Roman Games Festival, which took place every September. It started as a small festival in honor of the goddess of the hunt, but grew into a celebration of the entire Roman Empire. It lasted 5 days, taking place in the Roman Circus Maximus, the original circus built by the Etruscans. The main event was the Bona Dea, a procession featuring a chariot pulled by elephants, along with men dressed as hairy barbarians. These representations of the Gauls reinforced Rome's dominance over their former enemies, cementing the city's greatness in the eyes of the provinces. Other events included theatrical performances, chariot races, and beast hunts, but none were more anticipated than the gladiatorial combats. 6 pairs of gladiators would fight in the center of the circus, battling until one of them died or ran away. This wasn't considered cowardly, mind you, because the audience could leave whenever they wanted. In fact, the Romans had a word for them: expoliatos, or undressed ones. This referred to the fact that they ran away without their armor, leaving it behind for the victorious gladiator. Over time, these gladiators became celebrities, traveling around the province to fight in different arenas. They chose their own names, had fan clubs, and could negotiate contracts. It was a dangerous job, though, and many didn't live long. Punishments for losing a match ranged from exile to execution. And even if you won, there was always the risk of dying. Fights weren't fixed either, so competitors prepared for the worst by saving money for retirement and making wills for their families. So while gladiators may have seemed like superstars, the reality was far more grim. Now, it's worth mentioning that some gladiators did achieve celebrity status. One of the most famous was a woman named Millie. She specialized in sword fighting, appearing in almost 300 fights. She was undefeated, earning her the nickname Undefeated Millie. In reality, she probably lost fights, but news of her defeats never spread, so she kept her perfect record intact. Another famous gladiator was Spartacus, whose origin story is straight out of Hollywood. See, Spartacus wasn't your average gladiator. He was a Thracian prince who led a slave revolt in southern Italy. It lasted for 3 years, from 73 to 71 BC, and involved over 70,000 men. While Spartacus was never captured, the revolt ended in disaster. Most slaves were executed, and Spartacus's name was erased from history. That is, until modern times, when Hollywood created a movie about his life. While there's little historical evidence for Spartacus's revolt, there's plenty for gladiators. Archaeologists have uncovered a plethora of artifacts related to them, including their weapons, armor, and even their diet. That's because the gladiators left behind a lot of trash. Every bone, scrap of metal, and piece of pottery was carefully examined by archaeologists, giving us an unprecedented look at their daily lives. They found that gladiators ate a balanced diet, mostly composed of fish and vegetables. They also discovered that these fighters had a strong community bond, helping each other train and preparing meals together. In fact, some scholars believe gladiators formed something akin to a family, raising children and mourning the dead. It's safe to say they were much more than just ruthless killers. In the end, the gladiators were victims of circumstance, condemned criminals seeking a better life, and ordinary people trying to put food on the table. Some were born into slavery, while others fell victim to Rome's insatiable hunger for power. Regardless, they all played a critical role in shaping Roman history, helping them conquer Gaul, subjugate Egypt, and solidify their control over the Mediterranean. Now you'll never understand Gladiator without knowing about the Colosseum. And if you want to learn how it was built, stay tuned for the next video.